My name is Marco Kane Braunschweiler, and I run digital here at the museum, including the screen program, which this is a part of. So I'm very pleased to welcome, for the second time, Black Radical Imagination. So first off, I'd like to thank everyone here at MOCA who worked on this project, because without you guys, this would not have happened. Nevin Kaupali, Sarah Stifler, Karen Limon, Amanda Hunt, Priyanka Fernando, Eva Seta, Jen Son, Michelle Cho, Tracy Robinson, Mark Ayala, Nathalie Sanchez, Gary McKenna, and there's a couple other folks too. So Black Radical Imagination, as you guys know, is an international touring program of moving image shorts that highlights works from the African diaspora. This screening is the premiere of this year's program, so very happy to host that doubly. So Black Radical Imagination is co-founded by Erin Christovale, and Amir George. The 2018 program is curated by Jheanelle Brown and Darol Olu K. So first, a little about Erin. So Erin's the assistant curator at the Hammer Museum here in Los Angeles. Big time. She's also the curator of Black Radical Imagination with Amir George, which is screened both nationally and internationally in spaces such as MoMA PS1, here at MOCA, the Museo Taller José Clemente Orozco, and her exhibition history is quite long as well. Exhibitions include Awake in the Water, Meditations on Disaster, 2014 at the Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora and Arts, Memoirs of a Watermelon Woman, 2016, and Subtle Likeness, also 2016, at the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives here in Los Angeles. I think we could clap for one. And Selection, Democracy, Citizenship, and Freedom at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery, along with Baby Boy at Transmission in Glasgow. She is the co-curator of the Hammer Museum's biennial, Made in LA, which we're very, very excited for. And then she also recently organized Alternate Endings, Radical Beginnings with Vivian Crockett as part of Visual Aid's project, A Day Without Art. So that's a pretty substantial project as well, a lot of great work. Amir George, he's a filmmaker and curator, based in Chicago. He's the co-founder of Cinema Culture, which is a grassroots film programming organization, and co-founder also of Black Radical Imagination. As an artist, George creates spiritual stories, juxtaposing sound and image into an experience of nonlinear perception, something we like. George's films have screened at institutions and film festivals, including the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the ICA London, Anthology Film Archives, the Glasgow School of Art, here at MOCA, the Museum of Contemporary Arts Detroit, the Ann Arbor Film Festival, the Trinidad and Tobago International Film Festival, Black Star in Philadelphia, the Africana Film Festival, and the Chicago Underground Film Festival, among others. So, a couple quick housekeeping notes. As per usual, probably best to turn your phones off so don't disturb your neighbor. And you'll be able to see all these films on moca.org/screen starting tomorrow. So if there's anyone who really wanted to see the films but couldn't, they'll be able to go to the site and see them, and we're really proud to be able to do that. So let's not waste any time. I'd like to welcome Amir and Erin. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Marco. Well, this is number 6, I guess.
Yeah, number 6.
We started this project about like 5 years ago as a way to give like filmmakers of like color this like platform to show their work. We didn't expect it to be internationally, but it's kind of like became that way. And keeping with the essence of like the Black radical like tradition and what that is, we thought it was best to pass on the reins to new like programmers to further like expand on the concepts that we started with this program.
Yeah, so thank you guys for being here. We'll give some brief bios for Jheanelle and Darol, who are curating the 2018 program. So, Jheanelle Brown is a film curator, producer, and arts educator based in Los Angeles. Her curatorial practice is committed to honoring, expanding, and empowering Blackness in visual and filmic media. Her interests are oriented around experimental and nonfiction film and video, the relationship between musicality and cinema, the political film, and media. She recently moderated a post-screening conversation with filmmaker Haile Garima for the DeKalb County Library System and co-curated The Familiar Unknown, Mysticism in the Present Future with Darol Oluke for Los Angeles Film Forum, which will screen at MOCA in about a week. Brown is a graduate of USC's Cinema and Media Studies MA program.
Darol Oluke is a filmmaker, film curator, and doctoral student from and based in Los Angeles. He currently attends USC's Cinema and Media Studies PhD program, where his research examines the aesthetic and pedagogical significance of Black film history in relationship to the institutional development of film education and film training in American universities, with a particular focus on the LA Rebellion of film movement. His artistic, academic, and curatorial interests are committed to exploring the complexities and possibilities of a Black film aesthetic. And now we'll introduce Darol and Jheanelle.
Thank you.
First things first, we're matching intentionally. It's a thing we do. It's corny, but it's also fun. It's a thing we do. Whatever. Yeah, we're gonna keep this short because we're really excited to present this program. We're really excited for y'all to see it. But first and foremost, we want to thank Erin and Amir for trusting us with this. It's something that we're very honored by and we don't take for granted, so we're just happy to be on this journey with them. We'd like to thank all the filmmakers who are part of this program, 3 of which we're going to talk to later, so we're going to have more time with them, but we're really honored to screen your work. I think it's beautiful visionariness, definitely reparative and necessary for folks right now. We'd also like to thank Marco and the MOCA team for being great partners to work with and for allowing us to bring our program here. And a special shout out to Russell Hamilton. He's someone, he's a brother and he's been an extended member of helping us get this together. And he...
We're working it out.
Yeah, we got it. And also helped us put together the after party, which is at the Ace after this. Yeah. So there's that. But yeah, so we hope y'all find this program generative for thinking about the tensions, complexities, and possibilities of Black being in this contemporary moment. And so enjoy. Yeah. We'll talk later.
I'd like to welcome the filmmakers, Ephraim Asili, Alima Lee, and Dana Washington. Once again, just thank you all for coming here and sharing this experience with us tonight. And we'd like to just kind of jump right into it. So really thinking about this program, Jheanelle and I We're thinking about how we can kind of deal with themes of like grief and death, poetry, language, memory, and family and notions of home. But at the same time, we're also thinking about how we can also, or how these films carve out spaces to help us think about new inroads to self-actualization and freedom, and how these ideas are operating outside of the normal modalities of survival and suffering. So with this in mind, we kind of just want to start the conversation and ask you all to maybe speak about one of the most striking aspects of all of your films is basically how they use poetry and voice as formal conventions. And we'd like you to maybe say a few words about your film's relationship to poetry, and maybe a few more words about kind of the general creative impetus that led to you making the film.
Well, where to begin? For me, going back, I think, to my first film that I ever made, poetry played a big part in the process. My first film, I'm reading a lot of poems. These are poems. Actually, some of them are quoted in some of the other films, interestingly enough, but a bunch of poems by Sun Ra. And it's something that I kind of moved away from in this set of films, or in a set of films that I've been making, the one that we watched this evening being the last in a series. And for me, I feel like I've been a bit reserved at kind of doubling down on a sort of poetic way of approaching the filmmaking and having poetry with that. Like, I try to kind of keep that separate. So when I went to make Fluid Frontiers, I was actually interested in making a film kind of, I hate to say that my films are about things, but I wanted to make a film that very much engaged with this tradition of radical Black poetry. And at the same time, I was interested in this idea of, you know, we all grow up with these ideas around poetry, and poetry being this like deep, certain kind of experience that you have, and you read it a certain way, and you have to go like, oh wow, you know, that was deep, you know. And so, you know, but that's not necessarily everybody's experience. And so I was very much interested in this idea of, particularly with Broadside Press, this idea of sort of poetry for the people. But just because you say you're making poetry for the people doesn't necessarily mean it's being received by the people. And so I was interested in this idea of, well, what if I took these books by Broadside Press, which was started by Dudley Randall, and he was selling these books for $1 each at the time in Detroit. This is in the 60s into the 70s mostly, and kind of gathering all of these poems that I've been collecting, and literally just placing them in the hands of the people and seeing how everyone who read poetry in my piece, they weren't familiar with the poems they were reading, nor did I really know any of them. And so it was kind of like, you know, I was just approaching people, excuse me, would you mind reading a poem for this film? Then I'm making kind of a situation. And what I was trying to photograph was kind of how are people interacting with the poetry who may or may not have a background with it, and kind of really trying to kind of put the poetry to the test, you know, like, okay, does, you know, the person seem to be getting anything out of the experience? And for the most part, I feel like, you know, I see some sort of change in the person either as they're reading or after they stop reading, they kind of take a moment to think about what they've read. And so for me, it was this process of kind of trying to study the way that poetry sort of interacts with people, especially in a location they're familiar with, the fact that these poems are from Detroit and that the poets are published there, et cetera. On top of that, I mean, for me, in terms of this film, I was invited to that area to make a film, and I'd been collecting these Broadside Press books, and I thought, you know, I want to work with these materials in Detroit and Windsor where they were first published. And so that was kind of the general idea. And then in doing my research, I was like, wow, like all of these amazing poets got their start with Broadside, and I wanted to end my series kind kind of focused on taking a closer look at the role that Black women have played in recent history. And I felt like, wow, Broadside was a great entry point because that's where Audre Lorde got her start, Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, the list goes on and on and on, Margaret Walker, Gwendolyn Brooks. These are all people who are a very important part of that history, and so I wanted to kind of end the series kind of dealing with that, so.
With my film, I did the process kind of backwards of how I usually make films. My background's in mostly music video production, so I'll have a song or a poem that someone wrote and make a video based on that. But with this, it was kind of a self-reflection, and I didn't write anything for it. I kind of like had a note in my phone of how I was feeling one day, and I asked my friend Autumn if I could shoot with her, and it kind of panned out as this visual poem without any poem to it, or a written poem. So after I got the film back, and I edited the whole thing without sound or a poem to it, and I asked my friend Arima and Ringo if they could help me make the soundtrack to this and kind of use it as already a stepping stone to what it could be. So I went to Arima's house that night and she watched it, and I told her how I was feeling about it and the thoughts before making it, and she wrote something on the spot and recorded it to a jam that Ringo had done like in the past. So it kind of came together as this visual poem that all parts came together kind of simultaneously. It was made in the span of about 4 days, so there was like no rehearsal or no like research really. It was just like me and what I was feeling. But it seemed like a lot of people were feeling similar ways. So Arima wrote something really beautiful off top, and I feel like a lot of poetry, at least that I write or people around me, is just like really spontaneous, or it's just like a flow. So I kind of wanted to capture that spontaneity within the film. So it was really different than how I usually do things, but it kind of came out as my favorite piece because of that reason of the spontaneity of poetry itself.
So I have like a long backstory. Underbone is a film that was inspired by my maternal grandfather. And he was a pastor, and he passed last summer. And I was really thinking about how to encapsulate a certain period of time that I was going through, which was like my faith being tested, my maternal grandmother making contact with me and having that confirmation, and then like a relationship that was always in question. And then also my grandfather, who was hospitalized. So I was thinking about what he was doing and how he made a living off of his voice. And I wanted to try to carry that legacy on through speaking. I don't really call it spoken word. I really don't like spoken word. But how my voice is, it just whatever. It's spoken word. So I was really thinking about the heart, life, the spirit, and the ability to love and be loved. And so I wrote poems, fragmented lines of those different sections, and that was like the framework of Underbone. And then I sent like this, this crazy treatment to Kayla, and I was like, I had this weird thing. Do you want to do it? And she was like, yeah. But I want to say that speaking for me is very difficult because I have a speech impediment. And so I like to think of my voice as my superpower. And when I heard my voice from a speaker for the first time, that was when I understood how powerful it was and how commanding it could be. So now when I work, I always try to have something meaningful to say, along with the visuals. And I guess this just manifested as like a poem, like a poetic type of thing, with the blend of the music and the image.
In putting together this program, one of the things that Darol and I were thinking about was the act and the importance of bearing witness, specifically in this time, and specifically as Black folks live with a certain proximity to death. So this is a question for Ephraim. And I read recently that you were involved in MOVE, the organization in Philadelphia, and that really struck me. And because they were a group that suffered a very specifically egregious type of state violence, right? The only time civilians were bombed by the U.S. government on U.S. soil. So it's something that I think it's a thing that is really hard to wrap my mind around. But so I say all that to say I'm sort of wondering how that political imperative that was tied to your time with MOVE, if and how that's present in your filmmaking practice, in Fluid Frontiers, in the Diaspora Suite, which you kind of alluded to earlier. Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I spent, before I was interested in filmmaking at all, I spent a lot of time with the MOVE organization and with MOVE people. For people who don't know MOVE, they're still around, number one, but they were an organization started in the early 70s, more or less, by a man named John Africa, who was a sort of, well, he never went to school, he never learned to read or write, and he was raised in Philadelphia by his parents, and he was a sort of, well, he was a master carpenter. He could kind of build anything he wanted, and he could also, they say, just commune with any living thing and just understand how it operated. And he was able to, he started this organization where they would do things like take all of the technology in terms of in a house or in a home, and they just went totally like living off of, you know, back to nature, but still in an urban environment. So if they had a house, say in Philadelphia, they might remove all the cement from the sidewalk and grow vegetables there, or they might, you know, remove the heat and build a fireplace so that they could have, you know, wood-burning fire or whatever the case may be. And the more independent they came and the bigger the organization became, they would get attacked by the police more and more. Another thing that he was known for. And this, some of this stuff is very normal now, but for whatever reasons in 1970, whatever, it was very radical to have a baby at home. You know, now these things, oh, like a home birth, it's like a trendy thing. But at the time, it was like these Black people having home births were like forbidden. They also wouldn't take them to get Social Security cards, anything like that. So anyway, they were always being attacked by the police, and so that was their history up to a point, and then they were bombed. In 1985, I became involved with MOVE in the late 90s, and through that process, just learned a lot. But mostly, I learned about the significance of independence, of not, you know, always looking to, you know, the system for a means to survive, you know. And so for me, I tried to bring that, and I still try to bring that to my filmmaking, trying to make films in a way that I'm not necessarily dependent on a massive grant or, you know, corporate interest buying into my ideas so that I can fund the work. And so I think there's this, for me, this layer of sort of resistance in the work that's just like, I made it. Like, you look at my film, there aren't credits because there's no one else doing anything. It's like I'm shooting it, I'm editing it, I'm doing all the work, you know what I mean? And so it's just there. And so in kind of working on the suite in general, that's kind of an element that's been going on for me. But in terms of bearing witness in Fluid Frontiers, I was shooting and I was working in Detroit and Windsor right around the time that the election started to get really heated between Clinton and Trump. And they kept coming back to Detroit, and I kept thinking, like, this is really odd. And it was around that time, kind of spending time in the so-called Rust Belt, that I thought, I think this guy might win, you know. And I started getting really sort of like angry about the whole situation Clinton too, but it was a very frustrating situation. But I was also spending a lot of time on the Windsor side of the border. So I'm in Canada, but on the border where you're literally looking at the United States all the time from the river. There's a shot of the sunset in my film, that's from Canada, looking back at Detroit, and I'm kind of keeping an eye on all this activity that's happening at home, but from a distance, and also thinking about the fact that that particular location in Windsor is where, you know, Harriet Tubman and folks who were a part of the Underground Railroad, was the number one crossing point from the United States into Canada was right there on the Detroit River. It's the shortest distance from certain parts of, say, like Kentucky to the border, and the river would freeze over and people would walk across. And so there are all these people in Canada who have the same heritage as, you know, African American folks here. And I'm thinking a lot about that, and everything you hear, we're hearing at the time, there were a lot of people, similar story, knowing like, well, if Trump gets in there, we got to get out of the United States. But at that time, it was the Haitian community. They're like, you know, a lot of Haitian folks are trying to get out of the States and go into Canada. And I'm thinking about all of this as I'm working, and I happened to go to a record store one day, because I always happen to go to record stores, and find a way to do that. And I found that Margaret Walker record where she's reading about Harriet Tubman, and then that was this extra layer where I put the record on, and she's like, come to Canada, and I'm in Canada. And so this whole sort of esoteric thing started happening with it, and so it kind of all kind of grew out of that. But again, I'm always trying to kind of work in means that are just like, it's just me if it needs to be, and then again, trying to just deal with issues, and then kind of relating now to what came before us and these sorts of things. And so, you know, that's kind of, yeah, how it all came together.
This question is for Alima. Alima, can you, well, first I'll say I see your film, I see Garden as being very intimate and very tender. And I see it also as countering kind of the voracious consumption that Black film bodies are normally subjected to. And it's really a multi-dimensional rendering of Black film subjectivity that rejects normative modes of consumption. So thinking about this, I want to know if you could just say a little bit about kind of the juxtaposition that you make between everyday banalities and the performance kind of at the end of the film.
Well, the film started as a conversation with myself, and I was in a deep depressive hole where I couldn't get out of bed. I wasn't eating properly. I wasn't drinking water till like way later in the day. And it was affecting the way that I practiced art. And it had to do with a lot of outside forces of just being a Black femme body in the United States and constantly seeing terror and feeling everything. And it was weighing on me, and a lot of personal things as well. So it kind of began to unravel as this project where I wanted to address these issues. Why can't I get out of bed? Why am I not feeding myself, feeding my soul, and in turn, feeding my soul through my art, and how important that is and how necessary that is for survival, especially as a Black artist. We're not given platforms or resources very often to support ourselves, so we're kind of taking it from everywhere, and it's a lot of labor and a lot of hard work. And creating this conversation with myself, it kind of allowed me to overcome a lot of what I was going through. And I really wanted to highlight the mundane activities that you do every day, getting up, washing your face, feeding yourself, and how much of a struggle that can be when you're going through it, and when you're just not supported as much as you could be, or not supporting yourself. So it kind of came out as this poem about that for myself before there was a poem written for it. And I felt like I could connect with a lot of other people through that feeling. I know a lot of my friends are going through the same thing constantly. So I connected with Autumn, and it was so natural. We started with a conversation, and then I kind of just filmed her around her room and her house and her courtyard, and ended with this beautiful dance, kind of like a song for herself, honoring herself at the end of just trying to honor yourself with basic needs. It was really just a film about survival, and everyone had their part in it, added this level that kind of was coming from themselves. So it was a very collaborative piece, and I feel like having collaborative pieces like that are really important because we're all sharing similar narratives.
We just have one question for Dana, and then we're going to move on to the talk back. But you talked about your grandfather, Dana, earlier, and lineage is a big part of your film. It also seems like a way to carry grief, but also release it. That's just kind of how we see it. But if you could just say a few words about lineage and its presence in your film.
In Transference, the second story of the film is me audibly addressing my grandmother for the first time, her spirit. I believe that she's been making contact with me since 2008, and it's been 10 years. And I got confirmation in 2015 when my grandfather was having a conversation with my mother, and he was like, October 16th was the last time we had dinner. And I'd been seeing 10:16 on the clock for various years, and so it was like confirmation. So in Transference, I audibly addressed her for the first time, and I was terrified because I didn't know what the result would be. But I say her name, Bibi. Is this how I got these wings, being in your daughter's cocoon? I can feel your spirit. I can feel your spirit. It's nothing but power inside my bones. So I wanted to make a connection between 3 generations of women, my grandmother, my mother, and myself. And I don't know what that connection is just yet. I'm still finding out. I've been asking my mother questions, and I'm going to be like working on another project that's an extension of this part of the film. But many things happened after this film. I don't know, I'm very happy that I got to encapsulate this period of time on film, and I just know that my grandparents are reunited, and I might have played a role in that, which is another story. I don't know if I should get into that, but maybe somebody can ask a question. But yeah, I wanted to honor and acknowledge my grandmother as well as, my grandfather.
Real quick before we go into the talk back, I know some of the folks, especially for y'all in LA, some of your collaborators are here. If you just want to shout them out, we could get a hand wave real quick. We just want to recognize everyone in their work.
Kayla Reefer is the DP right here. I don't know if Arima Adara is here. Hey, she provided additional vocals. Sana in the back for the score, Illa Orbis and Naeem. Myself, Black Daughters.
Also Arima, shout out. Ringo, right here, Mind Design, he gave me the score for this film. And Autumn, my star.
Also, thanks for Ringo to letting us use your music in our trailer. Some of y'all might have seen online, so yeah. All right, so we're ready. They're gonna be mic runners, so for anyone that has a question, you just gotta do the thing where you wait for the mic to be brought to you, so, all right.
Don't be shy.
Hi, thank you guys so much for being here and for putting this program together. I was really struck by, I'm sorry, this isn't for the filmmakers. Maybe it is, you guys can answer this too. I was really struck by Francis Bodomo's film and the use of comedy in that. comedy and tragedy intertwined in this really beautiful and potent, powerful way. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the history of that, if you have other films that you might reference or recommend that would be kind of like within a similar vein of using comedy in that way.
I think for me, and maybe folks could add to this, I'm immediately thinking of, forget his name, but it's Chameleon Street. Wendell Harris, thank you so much. That immediately comes to mind. Does anyone, any other additions?
Just something I watched the other day that I think, Sidewalk Stories, I think is a good example. Charles Lane. I thought it was funny anyways.
I just bought it too. I saw you post it on Instagram, and I bought it like the next day. Just throwing it out there. Thank you.
Come on, y'all.
Hi. I'm from Detroit. I don't know if my microphone is on. You're on. Okay, cool. I'm from Detroit, so I was really struck by the film with all the poetry and seeing images that are right down the street from my house. And listening to you tell, like, you were there during the election when things were getting really tense. And I've always noticed the people in Detroit are some flavorful people, and who I love. What was it like being sharing something so artistic and kind of soft like poetry in a city that is almost on a nationwide scale? People think death, destruction, murder, blood, you know. How was that juxtaposed for you when you were there?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, also in this whole election cycle, you know, they were really both sides pushing this thing of Detroit as a failed city, and it's like, we're going to save it one way or the other kind of thing. And so you know, and this is anywhere I think you go, it's like you get the sort of horror story version of what it's like when you get there, and then you arrive in the place and you're like, you know, it's just like anywhere else. People are trying to survive, get by, and you have your negative elements, but for the most part, people are good people, you know. I'm from Philly, and for me, any city I've been to, Detroit feels the closest to Philly, and so I was like, I felt very at home in Detroit. But you know, the thing with Detroit for me as a filmmaker is that, you know, and a lot of artists go to Detroit and they film, you know, the buildings that are decaying, et cetera, and it's very easy to kind of fall into that workflow of like, wow, this old factory that's just kind of sitting there, or these empty lots where houses were burned down or something like that. And so I made a rule for myself, which was that, like, before I can shoot anything like that, I have to engage with 2 or 3 people from the community right then and there, talk to them, ask them, you know, a few questions or whatever the case may be. And that was my sort of way of forcing myself to engage people, because to be honest, yeah, it is a little bit intimidating, especially when you don't know how people are going to react to the poems, if they're familiar with the poets, that sort of a thing. And so, you know, I was kind of there with my camera and just trying to see what the vibes were from different individuals, but a lot of the time people would see me and maybe see me with the camera or just see me kind of wandering around and ask, like, what are you doing? And then I would say, well, this is what I'm up to, and then, you know, they would become involved in the film. So there's one woman who reads a poem by Sonia Sanchez where she talks about getting a PhD in Sonia Sanchezism, right? That came about because I was looking for broadside press books, and I was going to this bookstore, John King Books in Detroit, really well-known bookstore in the region, and she was the clerk, and so she was like going through and handing me the books that I was buying. She's like, what are you doing with all this stuff anyway? And she's like, I love Sonia Sanchez. And I'm like, oh, really? Like, would you want to read a poem for this movie that I'm making? And she's like, oh yeah, of course. And so we literally just, in that moment, went outside and read the poem, and it went from just one person to the next. And so for me, once I sort of started to relax a little bit, it was not too difficult to kind of get into a flow. And the more I engaged with people, everyone, almost, you know, unanimous response was, I'm so glad that you came to Detroit to show the beautiful things about where we live. And so I think whenever that's the case, it's a lot easier in terms of like, you know, a lot of the more difficult aspects of what's going on in Detroit in terms of, you know, violence or whatever people perceive to be going on there. I think, you know, once people kind of caught wind of what I was trying to do and kind of trying to honor the legacy of Broadside, it wasn't so difficult to get people involved. So, thanks.
Hey, how y'all doing tonight? My question is for Golden. First and foremost, I want to say that was a very powerful and beautiful piece. You know, it was really touching. When you were discussing it a few minutes ago, you said the word survival. How important is it to you that living out your inner beauty is a form of survival?
This is for me, right? Okay. I feel like living out your inner beauty is living out your most basic inner self, and being yourself unapologetically is so important to me, and it's important to every artist, I feel like. And that's why I kind of highlighted that part of Autumn dancing in her courtyard and just letting everything flow through her and being able to capture that I was like behind my little Super 8 camera just like tearing up because I was like, wow, like I'm kind of experiencing that vicariously through her. It was like a beautiful end to a really weird week. So yeah, I feel like knowing yourself and expressing yourself is the only way that I'll be able to survive. I couldn't survive if I wasn't making art. And I feel like I share that truth with so many other people.
And this is our last question up front. Thank you.
Ricky.
Hi, so I'm definitely fascinated with communication and connection in the spiritual realm as well. I lost my mother and my father, and I feel like there's just some powerful things that happen still in my life that they have a part in, and I explore these thoughts and ideas and feelings too, and I would love to know what part you feel like you played in that. So I'm asking that question.
Okay. All right, so with this 10/16 occurrence, when I got the confirmation that it was my grandmother making contact with me, around the time that my grandfather, his health began to decline, 10/16 showed more frequently. And the first time that I visited my grandfather in the hospital, he cried, and I had never seen him cry before. And so what was interesting was that he would always tell me that I reminded him of his wife, of my grandmother, in body stature, hair type. And I really think that he was seeing her through me that day. But what's interesting is on the day that he passed, like, I hope I don't cry, my mother and my sister and I went to the hospital. And it was kind of like this unspoken thing that this was going to be the last time we were going to see him. So we let my mother have her time with him. And she came out the hospital room at 10:12, and I looked at my phone, and I was like, okay, 10/16 is coming up. So she said she's going to go to the car. And so I stayed, and I waited until 10:16, and I took a photograph. And in my mind, I said, okay, BB, take him. And we left, and an hour later, we got the call that he transitioned. And I really think that my presence, you know, she was kind of like working through me to get to him because, you know, she died at a very young age, and they loved each other very much. And I think that she was working through me to get back to him. And I think I just kind of played a role, like I was a vessel, in kind of like allowing that to happen. Yeah. I'm gonna stop because I'm gonna cry.
Okay, so we'd just like to thank you all once again for coming out, experiencing Black Radical Imagination. Ew.